Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Forbes senior editor, Dan Alexander. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me.
This is another case, the second time you and I are talking, when someone was supposed to testify in this trial. They ended up pulling out at the 11th hour. This time, it's Donald Trump, the former president. What happened?
Well, Trump went on Truth Social, his social media network, last night and announced in an all caps 3-message statement that he was not going to be on the stand today. This makes some sense from a legal perspective. There really wasn't much that Trump was going to gain by testifying. But of course, he doesn't always think about things from a legal perspective. Sometimes he just likes being in the spotlight, likes getting the megaphone, and likes making the case in this particular suit, saying that the judge is biased against him and the AG doesn't have a case and all that sort of stuff. So it limits his ability to do that. But on the bright side for him, he doesn't have to worry about perjuring himself, and he can make all sorts of statements, many of which are not true, on social media and not have to worry about perjury laws there.
You are the reporter to follow when it comes to this case. You've been in the courtroom for the last 2 months. So personally, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, again, from a legal perspective, it makes a lot of sense that he's not on there. Truthfully, you could have argued that he shouldn't have testified in the first place. Although in a civil trial, the judge can infer negatively upon people not testifying. And so they wanted to avoid that. Now, having backed out, who knows how the judge is going to weigh all of that. This judge has already, in testimony that Trump said on the stand, said that he found the former president to be not credible. So we don't know that he would have believed anything that Trump was saying anyways. He sees this case fundamentally as a documents case. There certainly is enough documentation to view it that way. And I don't think that Trump getting up on the stand and saying, for example, that Letitia James is biased against him is going to tip the judge one way or another.
Personally, if I was on the stand and a judge said I was incredible, I'd be sweating a little bit. But as you noted, it's not illegal to lie on social media. It is, however, illegal to lie on the stand. You noted that he has lied on the stand before. So what are the chances that he's going to be charged with perjury for that, if at all?
I think any time that somebody is considering whether or not to launch a lawsuit, particularly a criminal one against Donald Trump, there's a high bar. And although he was not telling the truth on the stand, I believe that he knew that he was not telling the truth, although that's a harder question to get at. I would be surprised in this case if they tried him for perjury for his statements on the stand, simply because really you're not going to take a case against Trump unless you've got everything sort of perfectly sewn up. And it's very, very material. It's very clear that they were intentional lies. It's very clear that they were false. And so I'd be surprised to see, somebody conclude, okay, yes, we have all of that here, and let's go forward and press charges. However, that doesn't mean that he wasn't lying on the stand.
You posted on X a really long thread highlighting the fact that Trump isn't testifying, what that means, and you posed a really interesting question. You wrote this: what would Trump's testimony have looked like if he appeared on the stand today? Can you walk us through that? What would it have looked like?
Well, we have a couple of different data points. The first one is his previous testimony in this very case. So in that testimony, he lashed out. He lashed out at the attorney general. He lashed out at the judge, at one point yelling at the judge while he was on the stand, which is something that's very unusual to see in a courtroom. And he made all sorts of statements, many of which were not true. He tried to be in certain moments sort of calm and relaxed, and he was at certain times. But there was also just sort of this unpredictability of the whole thing. Another thing that we can look at is that the only Trump that the defense called as a witness was Donald Trump Jr. And they called off Eric Trump's testimony. They handled Ivanka Trump's testimony all through cross-examination when she was called by the state, and they now called off Donald Trump himself as well. In Don Jr.'s testimony, when he was called by the defense, basically they sort of went through a glossy PowerPoint and said, hey, look at all these beautiful buildings that the Trump family owns. They went through sort of the Trump family history, what all has Donald Trump built up, taking a business that his father and even his grandfather before him sort of planted the seeds for, and harvesting them and growing them over several decades. And here's what it's all turned into. There was a lot of pretty pictures to look at, and Don Jr. used words like magnificent, extraordinary, lots of superlatives to describe these assets. But of course, superlatives isn't how you value how many millions of dollars something is worth. You do that by looking at hard numbers. What are the square footages of a particular property? What the net operating income is of a particular property. And there was very little of those hard numbers. Some of the hard numbers that did appear in the presentation weren't true. How many floors were in a particular building, for instance? They listed an inflated number of floors that were in his property, both in Las Vegas and another one in New York. So if you look at those sort of data points, you can say, okay, so maybe this would have been kind of a, Donald Trump leaning back and saying, here's all that I've created. But then again, maybe he just would have used it as a moment to, wage war against the judge and anybody else in the courtroom who he wasn't satisfied with, and then use that to push this sort of grievance that he's been pushing since the start of the trial. I don't think that we would have seen any, new substantial information or testimony coming from Donald Trump that would have tipped the scale in the actual trial.
Last week, when we were previewing Donald Trump's potential testimony, you laid out sort of a pros and cons list for him. There were a lot of cons, but there was one pro, and that pro was this would generate a lot of headlines, a lot of media attention. He announced that he wasn't going to testify in an all-caps truth post. Does that pack the same punch, that absence, opposed to him actually going there when it comes to that media attention?
I don't think it carries everything that he would have gotten had he been in court, but certainly it still provides for some media attention on his claims, on the trial. We're talking about this right now. Plenty of people have been writing about it, have been writing about this all caps statement that he put out. So in some ways it does serve some of the same function. I just don't think he's getting quite as much juice out of it as he would if he actually had showed up in court.
And now that he's not on the stand, now that the trial is wrapping up, what are you looking out for next?
So the big thing is, what are the financial repercussions of this trial? How large is the penalty going to be? How does that impact Donald Trump's cash position? Are his business certificates canceled? And therefore, does he have to sell off certain assets? If he does have to sell off certain assets, is he going to sell them at fire sale prices? Are other developers basically going to view him as, a wounded victim who they can take advantage of and get something for really cheap? And that whole process is probably going to play out over the course of years. Remember, there are going to be appeals here. As that's all playing out, the rest of Donald Trump's empire is going to continue to grow. So I think ultimately what's going to happen here is this is going to hamper the Trump organization's ability to grow and expand. They're sort of going to have this hanging over them for a long time. It's going to affect how lenders are going to view them. It's going to affect what they themselves think about, can we do this major project or that major project? So I think that it's ultimately going to stymie the business, although not knock it out entirely.
Dan Alexander, per usual, thanks for your reporting. When there's more insights to be had, I hope you come back on. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to do so. Thank you for having me.